There was something very wrong with the substitute teacher. Ian knew it as soon as she opened the door to the classroom. This lady was bad news. The intruder seemed to fill up the entire doorway as she stepped into the classroom, impossibly wide and tall, with a long, dark skirt and a matching dress jacket. Her eyes were a little too bright. Her grin was just a little too sharp. Her gaze flickered across the room with machine-like precision, scanning faces and taking in the smallest of details for future consideration. It reminded Ian of a documentary he'd seen when he was a little younger. Some hour-long PBS special about lions in the African savannah. He could imagine her tongue snaking out to lick her chops as she stared them all down, a herd of nervous antelope with nowhere to run. Instead of calling out a greeting to get their attention, the intruder cleared her throat and stomped across the room, thumping her enormous handbag down onto the teacher's desk with a resounding whump that made the entire class flinch in unison. She flashed a ferocious smile and wrote, "Mrs. Blackmore," on the chalkboard, printing her name in a slanting line of angry-looking block letters. "Good morning, class," the looming figure bellowed as she clapped her meaty palms together with a sound like thunder. "I'll ask you to stop talking and give me your full attention, please." The classroom was instantly as silent as a tomb. The frightening woman gave the wide-eyed children a curdled grin and crooned, "Oh, that's much better. My name is Mrs. Blackmore, and I'll be your substitute teacher for today, and tomorrow, and probably for quite some time in the foreseeable future. I'm quite pleased to meet you all, and I hope—" Molly Rogers waved a skinny arm in the air and blurted out, "What happened to Miss Wright? Why isn't she here?" Mrs. Blackmore fixed her with a baleful stare and swooped across the room, her long skirt flapping behind her like the wings of a bat as she closed in on her prey. She leaned in close to Molly and hissed, "Molly Ann Rogers, there are 3 very important rules to follow in my class. Don't interrupt. Don't create a disturbance, and don't be a tattletale. We're not even 1 full minute into the school day, and you've already broken one of the rules." Molly shrank down in her chair, trying to make herself as small as possible. She whispered an apology at the floor. Mrs. Blackmore glared down at her, her left eye twitching with a barely contained fury, and she snarled, "They're always sorry when you reprimand them for misbehaving, aren't they? Mercy, yes, so sorry. Well, you'll hear every excuse in the book when you put one of the bad ones in the hot seat." The substitute stomped her way back to the chalkboard, pausing at the teacher's desk to hover close to her handbag. She started petting the lumpy old thing like a cat, and her scowl melted into a nasty little smile. The substitute whispered to her bag in a hushed tone, cooing a litany of soothing nonsense words as she scratched behind its handles. The class watched and waited with uncomfortable silence, darting sideways glances at each other as they nervously shifted around their desks. Ian thought the bag's tarnished zipper looked like a mouth, a wide, snarling mouth, its lips wrinkling back to expose dozens of sharp little teeth. Mrs. Blackmore gave the bag a final pat and erupted into action, her skirt swirling around her in rustling whirls of shadows as she busied herself at the front of the room. Looking at no one in particular, she said, "If you really must know, well, it appears that Miss Wright has gone missing." The class stirred with some muted chatter and rustling of restless feet. The substitute plowed on, talking over them in a tone that was brisk and vaguely sympathetic, like a newscaster reporting on some horrible disaster in a distant nation. "No one knows what happened to her, I'm afraid. She disappeared without a trace over the weekend, and now the police are involved. That's how these things go, I suppose. Some poor soul will just up and disappear one day, and they'll never be seen again." Molly let out a high-pitched squeak, her face as pale as milk, and Mrs. Blackmore shook her head in grave disappointment. She turned and began to write a series of math problems on the chalkboard. "It's not an appropriate subject to discuss in a classroom, is it, Molly?" Mrs. Blackmore was speaking to the chalkboard, scrawling numbers and mathematical symbols with tight, swift movements of her wrist. Why would you interrupt me with such an unpleasant topic? Why would you create such a horrid disturbance during my introduction? Molly looked like she was about to cry. She screwed up the last of her wilting courage and sniffled, I didn't mean to do anything wrong. It was just a question. Mrs. Blackmore whirled around and pointed at the trembling girl with a nub of chalk clenched between her fingers. Just a question, she repeated in an incredulous tone. Questions can be very dangerous, Molly. Mercy, yes. Very dangerous indeed. Please stay after class has been dismissed for the day, Molly. I'd like to talk to you further about improper questions and their consequences. But I didn't mean to... The substitute dropped the chalk and briskly clapped her hands together, a pistol shot that made Ian jump a little in his seat. He banged his knees against the underside of his desk and bit down on a yelp. Mrs. Blackmore roared, I don't want to hear any excuses! And everyone flinched in unison. See me after class has been dismissed, Molly Rogers. Is that understood? Tears welled up in Molly's eyes. She wiped them away with her sleeve and nodded. She looked like she was ready to faint dead away and flop into the aisle. Ian didn't blame her one bit. There was something feral lurking behind the substitute's laser precision stare, something unpredictable and wild. It seemed impossible they would actually hire this crazy lady to teach children. But there she was, standing at the front of the room with an off-kilter smirk on her face. Get your mathematics textbooks and open them to chapter 6, Mrs. Blackmore growled, and she slammed the teacher's copy onto the desk with enough force to rattle the windows. You're going to work on your long division skills this morning, all of you, she added, and her eyes fell once again on poor Molly Rogers, who was doing her very best to shrink into non-existence. There are 3 simple rules in my classroom, Mrs. Blackmore said softly. She was still glaring at Molly. I expect you all to obey these rules. Each and every one of them. She lapsed into silence and let it drag on for an uncomfortably long period of time, patiently waiting to see if anyone would be foolish enough to draw attention to themselves. Finally, she drew in a deep breath and returned her attention to the blackboard. Well, don't just sit there, she grunted. Start copying these problems down in your notebooks. We're going to do this until we get it right. After what seemed like an eternity, the final buzzer rang. Mrs. Blackmore dismissed her class with a curt, Go on then, get out of here. Not you, Molly. Ian caught up with Scotty and Mariana just outside the front entrance. On any other day, Scotty would be gleefully haranguing the other two with his manic stream of consciousness style of conversational discourse, while Mariana would be alternating between laughing at his antics and barking at him to shut his stupid shithole. But not today. Today, the trio walked together in silence. There was an unspoken elephant in their midst, and her name was Molly Rogers. It wasn't long before Scotty wordlessly pointed out the first poster, an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper with missing, printed in large, bold letters across the top of the page. Centered below this was a slightly blurry photo of Miss Wright, sitting in a lawn chair, smiling for the camera in a pair of cut-off denim shorts and a gray t-shirt. Ian stared at it in morbid fascination as they drew closer. According to the information below the picture, Miss Wright's first name was Lucille. She was 26 years old, she stood 5 feet, 7 inches tall, had sandy brown hair, and she was missing. There was at least 4 posters on every block, multiple Miss Wrights taped to streetlights and stapled to telephone poles. All of them smiling in the sunshine of a forgotten summer. All of them gone, without a trace. Scott slowed his pace and came to a stop as the trio approached the corner where they would split ways and head to their respective houses. He looked at the other two and said, What, no one's gonna say it? That substitute teacher freaks me out. I'm actually scared of her. I'm not even kidding. Mariana snorted. No shit. That lady's intense. Is she, 7 feet tall? She takes up the whole doorway. Mrs. Blackmore, Scotty intoned, as he wiggled his fingers at them in what he believed to be a spooky manner. Did you see her petting her purse like it was a friggin' dog or something? What was that about? She was baby talking to her own bag, dude. What the hell was that? Ian grinned uneasily at his shoes and said, She's a substitute, right? She won't be around for long. That bag of hers, it looked... The image of Miss Wright, sitting in a lawn chair, popped into his brain, and he trailed off in mid-sentence. Denim shorts and bare feet, Miss Lucille Wright. Missing at age 26. But what did that mean exactly? Missing as in what? Just gone? Where? People don't vanish into nothingness and stop existing, so where did she go? I just hope she leaves soon, Ian finished. And he offered Mariana an awkward, robotic-looking shrug. She's creepy. Mariana raised an eyebrow and asked, You okay? You're acting weird. Ian manufactured a weak flicker of a grin and croaked, I'm fine, everything's fine. Of course he's not okay, Scott interjected. Do you know this kid? He's nowhere near okay. Mariana snapped. Can you be serious for a second? You're like dedicated to being as annoying as possible. Scotty offered her a loud ripper of a fart in response and scrambled out of striking distance. He threw back his head and cackled, Choking my ass and die, Mariana! Whoop! Mariana gave him a withering look of contempt and turned back to Ian. Slowly, she said, Well, maybe she won't be there tomorrow. I really hope not. That lady scares me. Yes, that makes 3 of us, Ian muttered. He was thinking about the handbag. He thought about its yawning zipper mouth and the tiny brass teeth that glinted in the sterile glare of the fluorescent lights. Scott broke the silence by letting out a rumbling belch and declaring, That's what I think of Mrs. Blackmore. Gotta get home. I'll see you guys tomorrow. He turned the corner and swaggered down the street. A skinny, ginger-haired kid walking tall in red Converse shoes and a SpongeBob SquarePants baseball cap. Ian and Mariana both lingered a minute to watch him go. Felt like there was more that needed to be said out loud. Much more. But Ian didn't want to talk. Not now. He wanted to go home. Miss Wright was really pretty, Mariana said. Never realized she was so pretty until I saw the posters. I always thought she was old or whatever, you know? She looks different in school. Yeah, she wasn't old. 26 isn't old. Ian could tell that Mariana had a lot more to say on the subject of Mrs. Blackmore, but he didn't want to hear it. He didn't need to, anyway. He was thinking the exact same thing. He took a step back and said, Well, I should probably get home too. I'll see you later. I didn't like the way she was looking at us, Mariana blurted. The look in her eyes, you know? It was weird. It made me think of a story from this old book of fairy tales I had when I was little. It was called Hansel and Gretel. You know the one I'm talking about? So these kids are lost in the forest, right? And they find a house made out of gingerbread and they think that they're saved, but there's a witch living in the house, an evil witch, and she wants to eat them. Ian felt the fine hairs stand up on the back of his neck. He grimaced and shook his head. No, I don't know. There's something wrong with her though, for sure. Hey, I gotta get going, okay? I'll see you tomorrow. Molly had to stay behind, Mariana whispered. Ian pretended he didn't catch what she'd said and started to walk away. Frankly, he didn't want to catch it. All he wanted was to go home and curl up under a blanket. He would close the curtains, watch some TV, and not think about Miss Wright, Molly Rogers, or anyone else for that matter. He would curl up in a safe little hidey hole, and the morning would take care of itself. I'll see you later, Ian chirped over his shoulder, and picked up the pace until he was almost jogging down the street, thumbs hooked in the straps of his knapsack to keep it from bouncing around on his back. There'd be no more of that kind of talk, not today. It was officially blanket time. Ian was dismally unsurprised that Molly Rogers didn't come to school the next day. Ian did his best to ignore her empty seat. Looking at it made him feel like a bird was fluttering in his chest, hammering around in a panic to fly away and escape. It was best to not think about it. Try as he might, however, Ian couldn't stop himself from staring at Mrs. Blackmore's handbag. It stared right back at him, its brass button eyes full of animal cunning. The more he looked at it, the more it seemed to Ian that the bag had a face, a crumpled, hateful little troll face, a patchwork golem made from shadows, stains, and creases in the ancient leather. The illusion was completed by that wide, unsettling zipper mouth. Today it was partially unzipped, giving it a lopsided, degenerate leer. Ian didn't like it at all, not one bit. He was scared of his new teacher, but he was even more afraid of her handbag. Just before first recess, Mrs. Blackmore made a heinous discovery. Richie Gamble was chewing gum in class. This unforgivable act of rebellion was deemed disruptive behavior, and Richie was ordered to stay behind when the bell rang for recess. When recess was over, Richie was nowhere to be seen. No one asked where he went, or even dared to mention the fact he was gone. No one said anything at all. For the rest of the day, the classroom was as silent as a tomb. When the 3 o'clock bell rang, everyone drifted out like a ghost, all of them striving to remain unseen and unheard. Mrs. Blackmore positioned herself by the door and glared down at each student in turn, offering each of them a flashing sickle of a smile as they sidled past. There was a clear warning in that smile. There were rules, and the rules were not to be broken. Not ever. Ian slung on his backpack, shoved his trembling hands into his pockets, and steeled himself to walk past the teacher's desk on his way out of the classroom. He wanted to get a better look at her handbag. It was even uglier up close, and smelled awful. It reeked like a wet, moldy basement. Beneath that, there was the faintest hint of advanced decay. Ian had a nasty mental image of a pile of rotting corpses, all of them churning with maggots, moldering in the dark. It made his stomach roll. As he shuffled past the desk, Ian swore he heard a faraway babble of intermingled voices, as if a radio was playing something in the distance. The voices were too far away for their words to be intelligible, but it sounded like they were all screaming at the top of their lungs. Mrs. Blackmore snapped, "Is there something you need, dear?" And Ian's heart lurched. His only coherent thought was, "Oh shit, 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 shit." Ian looked up into those wide, wild eyes. He felt the blood drain from his face. He shook his head and stammered, "No, not, nope, I was just, I wasn't, I was just leaving." Ian tried to smile. He thought, "Good going, dummy, you don't look guilty at all, that was totally smooth." He steeled himself to walk past her and focused on the door, casually strolling along like everything was right and fine and normal as could be. Mrs. Blackmore's sickle grin collapsed a little further into a feral snarl with every step he took. Ian attempted to slink around her, a big, terrified smile plastered on his face as he turned himself sideways to avoid physical contact. He opened his mouth to say, "See you tomorrow," and the substitute's hand darted in with the speed of a cobra strike, seizing him by the shoulder and stopping him dead in his tracks. It felt like he'd walked into a giant and invisible blob of crazy glue. The soles of his shoes were stuck to the floor, and he couldn't move a single muscle, couldn't even blink. Mrs. Blackmore's broad, angled features filled his line of sight, blocking out the ceiling with the black curtain of her frazzled mop of hair. In a breathless rush, she told him, "There are 3 rules in my classroom, Ian. Don't interrupt. Don't be a disturbance. And the most important rule of them all, don't be a dirty little tattletale." Ian struggled to speak, making a faint moaning sound in the back of his throat. Mrs. Blackmore very slightly relaxed her grip on his shoulder, and Ian was suddenly able to utter a raspy little whisper. His voice was barely audible over the hammering of his heart. "I don't know what you're talking about," he gasped. "I didn't do anything." She offered a curdled grimace and crooned, "Not yet, but you will. I've been in this business for a long, long time, Ian. Mercy, yes, a very long time. I know the bad ones better than they know themselves. And there's simply no question, no doubt in my mind at all. You were a very bad boy. An awful boy. A putrid little tattletale." I'm not," Ian squeaked. I wouldn't do that, honest. Please let me go." The substitute studied his pale cheeks and bulging eyes, and Ian could see that she didn't believe him. His mind was screeching, "Run, run, 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 run," but he couldn't lift his feet off the floor. He could barely even swallow. Mrs. Blackmore shook her head in mock sadness. "If they ever discover my secrets, do you know what they would do, Ian? They would hunt me to the ends of the earth. They would bind me in chains of silver. They would burn me alive. Her fingers clamped down hard into his flesh, and Ian fell mute once again. He could scarcely draw a breath. The only movement left unchecked was the ferocious pounding of his heart. "That won't do, Ian. No, that won't do at all." Mrs. Blackmore raised her other hand in front of Ian's face, and she carefully traced an elaborate figure in the air with her finger. As her fingertip looped and whirled before his eyes, she chanted, "Asleep you'll be, until red you see, and then you'll sleep forever." Ian stared at the empty space where she'd traced the rune, and wheezed out a soft groan. He could see the shape twisting and twirling hypnotically in his mind's eye. A complicated series of lines and swirls that glowed red with potential secrets. The rest of the world fell away in strips and shards, and all that remained was the rune, whispering its irresistible demands in a tongue he couldn't quite understand. "Go on," Miss Blackmore crooned, and she released her death grip on his shoulder. Ian was abruptly free of the invisible force that was holding him in place, and he stumbled away on rubber legs, taking big, shambling strides out the door and all the way down the hall to the front entrance. Scott and Mariana were waiting for him outside, but Ian pushed right past them and kept striding along. His eyes rendered blind, his ears struck deaf to all sound save for the whispering of the rune. The people around him were nothing but vague shadows and inaudible background noise, dull flickers of motion in a world made of layers of nothing. It was all distant and completely unimportant to his mission. He couldn't stop moving his legs, nor did he want to. His legs walked him across the schoolyard, putting one foot in front of the other, all on their own, and there was nothing he could do but come along for the ride. He heard Scott yell, "Ian! Hey, dickface!" But it didn't matter. Scotty was unimportant. His words were faint buzzings of a housefly in a distant corner of the room, easily ignored. Just a few more steps and I'll sleep forever, Ian thought. And tears started rolling down his cheeks. Won't that be nice? From somewhere far, far away, Mariana shrieked, "Ian, stop!" But there would be no stopping. Not until he saw red. A big, beautiful wave of red would come crashing over him, and then he would sleep. Mercy, yes. 4 more steps. 3 more. 2 more. Now he would sleep. His eyes would close, and he would sleep forever. Scotty thundered, "Ian!" directly behind him, and he was abruptly hauled off his feet by a mighty tug on his knapsack. He fell hard onto the sidewalk, and a split second later a lifted Ford pickup truck screamed past at 30 miles over the speed limit, the driver laying on the horn as the brakes locked up with a tortured screech of rubber on pavement. The truck fishtailed wildly and scraped against the curb, leaving a long scuff across the cement as it shuddered to a halt. Ian stared at the truck in a daze. One more step. Just one. He would have been reduced to a grisly smear on the road. He took in a shuddering breath and croaked, "Holy crap. Holy fucking shit." Mariana was suddenly standing over him, her face frozen in a shocked expression that matched his own, almost perfectly. She slapped him weakly on the shoulder and croaked, "Are you serious right now? You almost died, dumbass! What the hell?" Beside him, Scotty reached over to slap his other shoulder, this time hard enough to sting, and he hissed, "The fuck, Ian? What's wrong with you?" Ian could only look back and forth between them and shake his head. He felt sick to his stomach. If Scotty had reached for him just a bare millisecond later, there wouldn't have been anything to grab. Ian would have been gone. A young man in jeans and a plaid shirt jumped out of the pickup and wailed, "Oh my God, is he dead?" A swarm of parents quickly surrounded the driver in a boiling cloud of righteous fury. He warded them off with outstretched arms and shouted, "I don't know what happened. My truck kept picking up speed. I couldn't slow down. I said I don't know what happened. Get away from me." A portly woman in a pink tracksuit detached herself from the milling ranks of the lynch mob and stormed over to check on Ian. She knelt down and shook a finger at him, her face a puffy blob of orange-tinted bread dough on oversized sunglasses. "I thought you were dead," she screeched at him. "If your friends didn't grab you, you would have been killed. Why weren't you paying attention?" Ian barely recognized what she was saying. He was staring at the fan of papers the woman was holding in her other hand. Her shrill, nasally whine faded to a faint drone as he blinked at them. A stack of 8x5s by 11 sheets. with missing printed across the top in large, bold letters. Miss Wright would soon have company. Molly Rogers was now starring in her very own poster. She was 5 feet tall, weighed exactly 85 pounds, and she was missing. The woman reached to seize Ian by the arm, and he surged to his feet, knocking her over and scattering her papers in the wind in the process. Ian ignored her high-pitched squawking and started to run. He ran all the way home and collapsed on his front porch with a burning stitch in his side. He lay there for a long time, panting for air and mewling from the pain of the cramp in his side. "Until you see red," he wheezed out loud. And he'd seen red, hadn't he? Actually, yes, the pickup truck was painted a deep, glossy red. A red as freshly spilled blood. Despite the greasy sweat that was rolling down his face and soaking his clothes to his skin, Ian broke out in goosebumps. Mrs. Blackmore's attempt to make his death look like an accident had failed. She would be coming for him. But what was he supposed to do? The substitute was a lioness, clothed in rustling shadows, an elemental force that clunked along in square-toed leather boots. She tried to make his death look like an accident and nearly succeeded, but next time, she wouldn't bother. Ian would simply cease to exist just like the rest of them, and his picture would appear on a stack of posters the very next day. He was a loose thread, and it was certain that Mrs. Blackmore wouldn't tolerate a loose thread. When a monster hides in plain sight, camouflage is everything. Her existence depended on skepticism of rational minds. It depended on no questions being asked and no suspicions being allowed to take root in the stony soil of an adult's barren imagination. Her existence depended on 3 rules, and rule number 3 was the most important of them all. There was only one thing he could do, and that was to break her precious rule. He had to tattle on her as loud as he could and hope for the best. The front door opened, and Ian's mother poked her head out to stare at him with a puzzled expression. She asked, "Why are you lying down on the porch? Come on, get inside, get washed up. Supper's going to be early tonight." The door swung closed again before he could answer. Ian hugged his knees to his chest and murmured to himself, "She already knows I'm alive. She's going to come after me." As soon as he said those words out loud, it dawned on Ian that Mrs. Blackmore had somehow known every student's name on the first day. Every single kid in the class. She'd never taken so much as a quick peek at the attendance list, not once. But she'd still known every kid's name. How? Ian already knew the answer to that question. Her handbag had told her. It was alive. Horribly and impossibly alive. From inside the house, Ian's mother bellowed, "Get in here and wash up! Supper's ready!" Ian hauled himself to his feet and opened the door with stiff, clumsy fingers. He'd never been less hungry for dinner his whole life. He didn't know how he was supposed to convince his parents that Mrs. Blackmore was a witch. But he had to figure it out right quickly, because he had only one shot at making them believe his story. After that, his pleading would fall on deaf ears. And then I'll sleep forever, Ian thought. And he blinked away the tears that threatened to start pouring down his face. He took in a deep breath, said a quick prayer to whoever might be listening, and stepped inside to face whatever might happen next. "You're pretty quiet over there, bud." Ian didn't look up from his plate. He hadn't eaten anything yet, and he didn't intend to either. He had never been less hungry in all of his life. He muttered, "Yeah," and resumed pushing his potatoes around with his fork, painfully conscious of his father's prying gaze. Now that it was time to blow the whistle, he felt numb all over. He suspected he was probably in shock. Ian wasn't sure what that even meant, but he knew he was ready to start screaming at any second. "Well?" Ian's mom prompted. "You want to tell us what's on your mind?" Ian was suddenly struck by doubt. Was he doing the right thing? What if he didn't say anything? What would Mrs. Blackmore do if he came strolling into the classroom tomorrow morning like nothing had happened? She'd put me in her handbag, he thought. That's what she'd do. She'd shove me into its mouth and then I'd be missing. He took a deep breath and tried his best to summarize the events of the past 2 days, struggling against tears as he stammered and sniffled his way to the end of the story. When he was done, Ian gradually became aware that an ominous silence had descended over the table. His mother was staring at him with a bubbling mixture of anger and dismay. She skinned her lips back from her teeth in a furious little grin. "Let me ask you something, Ian, okay? How old are you?" Ian gaped at her with his mouth hanging open. He hadn't seen his mom look this angry in a good long while. He'd been so consumed with terror, he didn't even consider his parents might think he was out and out fabricating the entire story. He sputtered, "Okay, I know it sounds like I made it all up or something, but I swear I'm not lying to you, Mom. Why would I do that? Please, come on." "I know you're very upset. I understand that," she said quietly. "We're all very upset. Believe me. You've been in school with Molly Rogers since kindergarten. We've talked to her parents on many occasions. What I don't know is if you fully understand the gravity of this situation. Do you?" "You're not listening," Ian shot back, and his voice broke on the last syllable. "They didn't get taken by, some weird guy or in a van or something. It was Mrs. Blackmore. I swear it's true." His mom gritted her teeth and hissed, "Okay, I'm listening. Run it by me one more time, okay? Go ahead." "His substitute teacher is an evil witch," Ian's dad grunted. He was staring at his son with an expression of distaste, as if he were looking at something unsavory he'd found clinging to the sole of his shoe. "She steals people and puts them in her handbag. Oh, and she cast a spell on him that made him walk into traffic. Did I leave anything out, Ian?" "A witch!" Ian's mom yelled, and she smartly rapped him on top of his skull with the handle of her Butler knife. He clapped his hands over his head and opened his mouth to start hollering, but he was immediately shushed with a violent wag of her finger. "Answer my question. How old are you?" 11, Ian sniffled. His eyes were wide and wounded. He simply couldn't believe his parents thought that he was making the whole thing up. "It wouldn't matter if I was 57 years old, though, because I'm not lying to you, Mom." "You're accusing a substitute teacher of freaking witchcraft! For Christ's sake!" she snapped. "Think about that for a second, okay? What the hell is wrong with you?" "I'm not lying," Ian blubbered. "She fed them to her purse. There's more people in there, too, not just Miss Wright and Molly. I heard them screaming." His mom clenched her teeth and spat. "What is this? Are you looking for attention, or what? How do you think Molly's parents would feel if they heard you saying this ridiculous bullshit, huh?" Ian groped for something to say in his defense. Anything. And he started to cry instead. He shook his head and sobbed. "I'm not lying to you. If you don't call the police right now, she'll get me too." "Oh, enough," his mom exclaimed. She flung the butter knife down in disgust and glared at him with her lip curled into a snarl. "I have half a mind to call the school tomorrow and arrange a meeting with you, me, and the substitute teacher and the principal. How would you like that, Ian?" Ian shoved his chair back from the table and sputtered, "What? No, she'll—" "Shut up, Ian," his father growled, and he glared at his son with hands clenched on the kitchen table. "I'm shutting this down right now. If I were you, kiddo, I'd just admit that I was lying and let it go." Ian's vision was blurred with tears, hot and acidic as they rolled down his face and dripped off his chin. He'd find no help here, not at his own table. He took in a shaky breath and wheezed. I was lying. I'm sorry. It was a dumb thing to do. I'm really, really sorry. May I please be excused?" His mother rolled her eyes and barked, "I think it's time for you to start growing up, don't you?" "Yeah, sure," Ian sniffled. "Can I please leave now?" His mother nodded without looking at him. Ian fled the dinner table and hid away in the sanctuary of his bedroom. He pulled the curtains shut and sat on the floor with his back against the wall. It was comforting, somehow. It made him feel safe. A warm and cozy feeling that would soon be in very short supply. Telling his parents about Mrs. Blackmore had been a mistake. Telling any adult would be a mistake. They wouldn't believe it unless they saw her in action with their very own eyes, and that would never happen. Mrs. Blackmore would take extra care to dial down the weird when speaking with a concerned parent. She was undoubtedly very skilled in the art of fooling grown-ups into not seeing her true nature. How did she get hired for the job in the first place? Certainly not by acting like an off-kilter psycho. Maybe she just cast a spell on the person that hired her, Ian thought as he shuddered. Yet another detail he hadn't thought about. As far as he knew, the entire school staff could be under her power, including the janitor. In fact, it was possible. No one could see her for what she really was unless she wanted them to. Adults and kids alike. She might have a pleasant and unremarkable face for the rest of the world, and another one solely for those who she intended to shove, whole and screaming, into the bowels of her handbag. Because it's like when they're all really scared, Ian muttered to himself. It makes them taste better. Ian heard his cell phone vibrate from inside his daytime prison in the top drawer of his dresser. He wasn't allowed to take it to school because his mom was convinced he'd use it to cheat during a test. It was a text message from Mariana. Are you okay? I can't believe you didn't get run over today. What happened? Ian stared at the message, and he struggled to come up with an answer that she would both understand and accept. Finally, he squinted his eyes against the tears that wanted to flow and typed out, She made me do it. I couldn't stop. Immediately, Mariana texted back, Are you talking about Mrs. B? Because I would believe that. I think she's a witch. Ian let out a low, anguished groan and responded, She's the one who kidnapped Mrs. Wright. Molly, and all the rest of them too. Lots of people. She has them in her purse. I heard them screaming in there. Mariana started typing, then abruptly stopped. A few seconds later, his phone started to ring. Ian, she said carefully, I think I believe you, but I just want to make sure you're not messing with me. Are you? Because I'll kick your skinny white ass if you're just making this up to mess with me. No joke. Ian clenched his teeth and growled. I'm not. Do you think I almost got run over to prank you? Holy crap! Give me a freaking break! Mariana sputtered. Okay, I'm just saying. I mean, that lady is a freak. Of course I believe you. It's really weird, you know? None of the other teachers seem to think that there's anything weird about her. Like, I saw her talking to the principal today, and I swear he was looking at her like she's a hot movie star or something. I mean, I could practically see hearts in his eyes. It was really weird. I think she looks and sounds a lot different to other grown-ups, Ian said softly. I think she looks the way they want her to look, you know? Kids are the only ones who see her, the real her. Like, who would ever hire that lady to work at a school? Ian trailed off, grasping for the words that would best convey his troubling and ill-defined hunch about the true nature of their substitute teacher. He settled with, She's almost like a cartoon or something. I don't know how to describe it. It's like she's a villain from a Disney movie. A caricature, Mariana interjected with a soft, musing tone. Like a caricature of a witch from a fairy tale. They both lapsed into silence for a moment, both of them unsure of what to say next. Finally, Mariana let out a shaky breath and said, This is so freaking scary. I hate it. You're telling me, Ian croaked. She's gonna come after me. I broke the third rule. I told on her to my parents. But it doesn't even matter because they think that I'm lying for attention or some stupid shit. I don't know what to do. Mariana barked. Well, don't just sit there and get killed. Call the police. I mean, don't tell them she's a witch or something like that. Tell them she tried to kill you. In a less confident tone, she added, They'll have to come check it out, right? That's their job. That's a terrible idea, Ian grunted. What am I going to say? Like, hello, police? My teacher tried to kill me, so can you please come to school tomorrow morning and shoot her or something? They'll come and talk to her, and they'll talk to my parents, and then everyone will deny everything, and I'll be screwed. I can't prove she did anything wrong. It's just my word against hers. At that instant, Ian's mom suddenly came bursting into his room, making him utter a shrill little screech of terror as she flung the door open. She jabbed a finger at his phone and demanded, Give me that phone right now. I heard what you said, and that is not happening. Ian immediately ended the call, but he didn't hand over his phone. Like hell, he was about to do that. No way. He forced himself to return his mother's furious stare and said, You shouldn't be eavesdropping. I deserve some privacy. She snorted in disbelief. and slowly shook her head at him. You can have all the privacy in the world when you're living out on your own. Until then, you're living in my house, under my care, and there will be no secrets. Now give me the phone. He held his phone behind his back and said, No, what for? Because I said so, Ian, she hollered. And despite his best effort to stand firm, Ian flinched. For as long as he could remember, his mom's words had been the law in their house, and the reason behind every sharp command and illogical rule was because she said so. But not anymore. Ian abruptly decided, nope, not anymore. He jumped to his feet, slid open the window screen, and tossed his phone down the slope of the roof. It skittered across the shingles and landed in the gutter with a shockingly loud bang. Ian looked back at his mom, his eyes wide and afraid, and he panted, You want my phone, Mom? Fine. Go out there and get it. Momentarily struck dumb by the wholly unexpected and monumentous act of rebellion. Finally, she gasped. Why, you horrible little shit. Why did you do that? Do you know what you just done? Ian smiled bitterly through a sudden gush of tears and sniffles. You're the least of my problems right now, Mom, okay? Just go away. Just leave. His mom shook her head at him again and murmured, You're grounded. She had a stricken expression on her face, like she'd just experienced a devastating and unforgettable betrayal. Don't come out of your room tonight unless you have to use the bathroom. Do you understand? You're grounded, Ian. Sure, Ian sighed, and he gently pushed her out of his room, another act of defiance that would have previously been unthinkable. She looked like she wanted to raise her hand to him, as she had done on so many other occasions in the past. But she didn't quite dare, not this time, and as far as Ian was concerned, never again. Grounded, she said in a broken whisper, and Ian closed his bedroom door on her without another word. Perhaps his dad would come up the stairs to mete out some misguided justice after she was gone, but Ian didn't think so. He was pretty sure she'd stay away from him for the rest of the night because somewhere deep down, they knew he was telling the truth. They knew, and it had frightened them. So they'd gotten angry with him instead, because it was easier to be angry than to be scared of forces beyond their control. Such was the strange and unspoken dichotomy of all parents. They were bound by the laws of adulthood to protect their children. But whenever a threat arose that made them feel powerless, well, they just got really mad at their kids instead. Ian would never understand that, not in a million years. But it was true. Later on, under the cover of darkness, he carefully crawled down the slope of the roof and fished his phone out of the gutter. It had survived the ordeal with only a few minor scratches. Ian found himself peering down at the clump of bushes below and wondered if he'd be okay if he was ever forced to jump down. The thought came out of left field, and it made him shiver a bit in the cold night air. Sure friggin' hope so, he thought. He crawled back into his bedroom, wriggling through the open window like a pajama-clad worm and lowering himself onto the floor as quietly as possible. He had a few unread messages waiting for him. One from Mariana, and it said, Your mom's being a huge bitch. Are you okay? He answered, It's all good. She's gonna chill out for now. We had a talk. Anyway, I have a plan. I'm gonna play sick tomorrow and stay in bed until everyone's gone. Then I'm gonna call the school and ask for the principal. I'll tell him Mrs. Blackmore tried to kidnap me, and I almost got hit by a car when I was trying to run away from her. I'll ask if I can come talk to him in his office, and you and Scotty come with me to back me up, please? Mariana blasted back. What the hell, Ian? In a jumble of angry-looking all caps. No, you idiot, call the cops. As if the principal's gonna care what Scotty says. What's wrong with you? Just call the police. Ian smiled wanly at the screen and typed, The police won't take me seriously, but they'll listen to the principal. He's a grown-up. I'm just a kid. Sucks, but that's the way it is. Well, yeah, I guess, she agreed reluctantly. Message me after you talk to him, okay? We'll come to the office with you. Ian promised he'd let her know how it went as soon as possible, and they both said goodnight. He checked the second text message and slowly shook his head. It was from Scotty, who messaged, Knock, knock. It was followed almost an hour later by, The punchline was Doctor Who, get it? You say who's there, I say doctor, and then you say Doctor Who. God, you're such a dickhead for not answering. It's a good one. You wrecked it. He tucked his phone in his pocket and crept out into the dark hallway, carefully trying to avoid creaky spots on the floor as he made his way to the bathroom. He shuffled back on his tiptoes, pausing in front of his parents' door to make sure that he could hear his father quietly snoring. Satisfied that they were asleep, Ian slipped downstairs to fetch his running shoes out of his gym bag. He had a nagging and worrisome notion that it would be best if he were prepared to skedaddle on a moment's notice. Just as he was easing his bedroom door shut, Ian felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. He fished it out, looking at the screen, frozen just as still as a marble statue. His face drawn back into a tragedy mask of shock and dismay. The phone number came up as unknown, and the message only had a single word. Ian read it over and over again, his brain frozen in a tight loop of brute panic. The word, of course, was tattletale. Ian turned his phone off and shoved it beneath his pillow. He lay on his back and stared up at the ceiling, his mind racing a million directions at once. He hardly closed his eyes at all that night. "You're not sick. Quit faking and get the hell out of bed." Ian's mom was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed and her foot tapping in impatient rhythm. Up until yesterday, this would have been enough to send Ian scrambling to do her bidding, but it wasn't going to be like that anymore, and certainly not today. He groaned. "I don't feel good. I can't go today." It was not exactly a lie. Ian felt awful. He hadn't slept more than 10 consecutive minutes throughout the entire night. "Ian, I don't have time for this," she snapped. "I know what you're doing, I know why you're doing it, and it ain't happening. Knock it off, get up." Ian put the blanket over his head and mumbled, "No, I'm staying home. See you later." She growled, "If I don't pull out of that driveway in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to be late. If you make me late, Ian, so help me Jesus, I'll..." She trailed off, suddenly unsure of herself. She rubbed her palms against her eyes and said, "I can't believe you, Ian. Tell me something. Who's going to watch you today, huh? Your father's already gone, and it's way too late for me to call in. For God's sake, kid, I really can't believe you." "You don't have to," Ian whispered. "Just go to work. Leave me alone." She groped for a response. Her mouth turned down in a grimace of sour dismay, and she finally settled with, "Okay, fine. Fine by me. If you hurt yourself somehow, it's your responsibility." She glanced at the clock hanging on the wall and muttered, "I have to go. We'll talk about this later." Ian pulled the curtains open to watch his mom leave, his face drawn and exhausted in the golden morning sunshine. She cast a troubled glance up at his window as she hurried down the driveway to her car. She looked vulnerable and diminished in the muted light that filtered through the gathering storm clouds. Ian discovered that he kind of felt bad for her, which was pretty funny when you consider that... Wait, what? Ian blinked up to the sky. It had been fair, bright, and blue just a few scant heartbeats ago, but now it was blanketed in a rolling wave of threatening clouds. What the hell? He looked back down at his mom and gasped. Mrs. Blackmore was suddenly towering over Ian's mother in the driveway, gripping the smaller woman by the shoulders as she whispered into her ear. His mom listened and nodded woodenly down at her feet, her arms dangling at her sides. Her purse slid off her shoulder and fell onto the asphalt, releasing a scatter of change, old tubes of lip balm, and other purse detritus in a jingling wave. His mother didn't even seem to notice. She was lost in the spell, a puppet of the substitute's iron will. Mrs. Blackmore took a step back, smirking to herself as Ian's mom turned and got into her car with jerky, disjointed movements. Ian threw open his window and shrieked, "No! Mom, don't go! Mom!" She stuck her arm out of her window and waved at him like a marionette. Her eyes appeared to be completely rolled back into her head, two white ovals glaring sightlessly from behind a slack, expressionless mask. She smiled up at his window, a mechanical twitching of her lips, as she started backing out of the driveway. Ian bellowed, "No, don't leave!" But it fell on deaf ears. 6 seconds later, her car was rolling down the street. Mrs. Blackmore was looking up at his window. Her eyes gleamed and flickered in the murk of the gathering storm. She raised an arm high above her head, and when she dropped it to her side, a driving rain fell from the sky in a heavy curtain. Lightning licked across the racing clouds, briefly illuminating the front yard in stark relief. And Ian saw Mrs. Blackmore was carrying her handbag. She advanced up the driveway with a brisk, confident stride, looking up at his window the entire way to the front porch. The rain curved away from her on all sides, bending against nothing in a perfect dome of dry air in the midst of the downpour. She paused in front of the steps and made a slashing motion with her hand, summoning another bolt of lightning that struck a transformer down the street with a tremendous bang and sizzling pop. The world outside his window immediately disappeared beneath a heavy veil of rain and shadow. A hot jolt of sheer panic slammed up Ian's spine, making every muscle fiber in his body stand at rigid attention. They were coming for him. Mrs. Blackmore and her trusty handbag. And he would soon disappear. Downstairs, the front door smashed open beneath a powerful kick from a square-toed boot, and the howling wind slammed it against the wall. Ian froze and listened intently, a film of greasy sweat glistening on his forehead. He was abruptly seized with a burning need to urinate. Heavy footsteps clomped across the living room and approached the staircase. Whunk, 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 whunk. They paused at the bottom step and Mrs. Blackmore called out, "Are you hiding under your bed, Tattletale? The bad ones always hide. Mercy, yes. You can just about set your watch to it." While his unwanted visitor taunted him from the foot of the staircase, Ian was frantically pulling on a pair of windbreaker pants over his Spider-Man pajama bottoms. As she ran, cackling up the staircase, he jammed his bare feet into his running shoes, zipped his phone into his pocket, and scrambled to the bedroom window. Rain slapped his face in a cold, stinging barrage as he slid and crab-walked his way down the slope of the roof. The drop to the bushes below seemed a heck of a lot further than it had the night before, but the alternative was infinitely worse. Mrs. Blackmore popped her head out of his bedroom window, her eyes blazing with malignant glee, and she screeched, "People go missing, boy! People go missing all the time!" Ian flinched away from her, a scream on his lips, and the sudden movement made him slip and fall into the shrieking winds. There was a second of whirling confusion, a high-pitched shout of pure terror, and then gravity slammed him deep into the prickling depths of a boxwood shrub. Crunch! Mrs. Blackmore rolled into the howling wind. "You get back here right now! You bad little bastard! Get back here!" Ian flopped out of the bush and lurched to his feet. He took off in a shambling run, kicking up splashes of rainwater with his heels as he fled down the street. A bolt of lightning ripped out of the clouds and struck a large elm tree across the street, pounding flash of doom that made Ian stumble in his tracks. He screamed against the ferocious gale that was trying to push him back, and kept on running. From somewhere, not far behind, Mrs. Blackmore howled into the rain with murderous, elemental joy. The hunt was on. As much as she hated bad children who break the rules, Mrs. Blackmore adored the hunt. "Run as fast as you can, you nasty little beast," she bellowed triumphantly. "It doesn't matter. I'll find you." Sobbing and choking for breath of the merciless downpour, Ian floundered his way to the corner. He splashed through a particularly deep puddle, and from one stride to the next, found himself slapping soggy footprints onto a perfectly dry sidewalk. He squinted against the unexpected dazzle of early morning sunshine, and his full-on sprint petered out to a confused, stumbling walk. In the space of one footstep to the next, the storm had vanished. The sun was shining, and the sidewalk was milling with people escorting their young ones to school, and Mrs. Blackmore was nowhere to be seen. Ian suddenly felt faint. He put his hands on his knees, struggling not to vomit from a combination of terror and shock and adrenaline overload. Cold rainwater dribbled from his sagging clothes and pattered down onto the warm concrete beneath his feet. He was completely drenched, but there wasn't a single cloud in the sky. When the nausea passed, Ian stood straight up and panted to himself. "Holy shit balls, that was way too close." He was answered by a quick blip from the horn of a passing vehicle. He realized that people were staring at him as they drove by, their expressions ranging from mild concern to belligerent suspicion. He realized how odd he must look, sopping wet, gaping in slack-jawed amazement at a perfectly unremarkable day. His earlier need to urinate came back with a sudden vengeance. He was about 20 seconds away from involuntarily wetting himself, an unfortunate mishap that he simply did not need right now. Gritting his teeth against the screaming in his bladder, Ian darted across the road and made a beeline for a narrow copse of trees between two houses. He scrambled into his sparse sanctuary and peed for what seemed like an eternity, leaning against a tree while his entire body trembled in relief. "She actually scared the piss out of me," Ian wheezed, and he let out a peal of shrill, unbalanced laughter. Across the street, a suburban dad type in flip-flops and cargo shorts paused to stare at the shrubby patch of trees with a disapproving frown. His two young children were too involved in their conversation about the relative merits of various superheroes to note his dad was no longer moving forward, and they both crashed into his legs with terrific force. The man stumbled from his sudden impact, his face flushed red with embarrassment. He snapped an angry rebuke at his children, a finger pointed stiffly at their surprised little faces. Then he cupped his hand around his mouth and shouted, "Whoever's smoking dope in those trees, you better knock it off before I call the cops." Ian resisted a powerful urge to leap out of his hiding, give suburban dad a finger, and yell, "People go missing, didn't you know that? They go missing all the time." Instead, he hunkered down in the weeds and waited for Mr. Nosy to go away. Ian did need the police to come, hell yes, but not to hassle him for being a public nuisance. He needed them to be willing to listen. He needed to make them understand that... His phone started to vibrate in his pocket. Ian looked at the screen and uttered a low groan. It was a call from an unknown number. Ian was pretty sure he knew who was on the other end. He answered without saying anything, and an all-too-familiar voice chuckled into his ear. "Hello, brat. Oh, I'll be back for you soon, not to worry. But I have another errand to attend to in the meantime. Loose lips sink ships, as they say. Would you like to see what it is?" The call abruptly ended. And seconds later, a text message with an image attached. It was a picture of Mariana's house. Mariana was walking down the front steps, looking down at her phone, with her backpack slung over one shoulder. Ian whimpered, "Oh shit," and immediately tried to call her. There was a series of odd clicks in his ear, and then a wailing cacophony that made him cry out in surprise. He dropped his phone, and it shimmered like a heat mirage in the weeds, then bubbled and melted into a colorful paste of ooze that sank into the dirt. Ian stared at the remains in disbelief. "Mariana," he whispered. "She's coming for you." Ian hastily changed out of his wet pajama bottoms and came bursting out of his hiding spot, leaving them behind on the ground beside his melted phone. He yelled, "Mariana!" at the top of his lungs and took off running down the street. "Look out! She's coming for you!" Mariana shaded her eyes and frowned at her phone in the bright morning sunlight. She'd just gotten a text from Scotty saying, "Come meet us at the dragon tree before school. Ian wants to tell us something." She messaged back, "Be right there," and she headed for the park with leaden feet. Her stomach was fluttering and flip-flopping with anxiety. Trooping into the principal's office to confront him about Mrs. Blackmore had seemed like a great idea last night, but her resolve appeared to have shriveled up and died overnight. The absolute last thing she wanted to do was step foot inside the school. At the same time, scuttling back to the house and hiding under the bed wouldn't make the situation go away. Mrs. Blackmore would steal another classmate today, and tomorrow, and every day until she was forced to flee to another town and another identity. She would continue with her grisly harvest until someone finally gathered the courage to stand against her. Unfortunately, that someone was going to have to be Mariana and her two dorky friends. The dragon tree was an enormous weeping willow in the south end of the park. As the three of them got older, the dragon tree looked less and less like a dragon every year, but the name had stuck. It was a convenient meeting spot that afforded a modicum of privacy beneath the hanging folds of its branches. The perfect headquarters for three kids who all lived just a few blocks away from the park. Mariana entered the park through the north gate and headed for the tree at a brisk pace. She dreaded hearing whatever it was that Ian wanted to tell them. There was very little chance it would be good news. She saw Scotty peeking out from between the sagging branches. a pale, skinny oval of a face topped with unruly red hair. She waved at him, and Scotty stared at her blankly in return, not smiling or waving back. He abruptly pulled back and disappeared behind the foliage, leaving Mariana with her arm in the air and a greeting on the tip of her tongue. Mariana slowed to a stop, a frown creasing her brow as an inexplicable chill made gooseflesh stand on her arms in the warm sunshine. That wasn't very Scotty-like behavior at all. Something must be wrong. She dodged around a group of smaller kids and approached the dragon tree with screaming nerves. She braced herself for bad news and stepped through the branches, blinking owlishly as her eyes adjusted to the relative gloom on the other side. Scotty was standing nearby, leaning against the trunk of the tree and staring at her with that blank expression on his face. Mariana looked around and asked, "Where's Ian? I thought he was supposed to be here." Scotty looked at her and said nothing. Mariana waited for a response, then yelled, "Earth to Scott, hello? What's wrong? Why are you..." Mariana trailed off as Scotty's head suddenly detached from his body, drifting off his shoulders and floating to a soft landing on the ground near her feet. His body melted away into scattered shadows, there and gone in a heartbeat. Mariana gaped at the empty spot where he'd just been standing. She reached down with trembling hands to pick up his head, which was actually a white balloon with a bunch of lines scrawled in red marker for hair. His face consisted of 2 dots for eyes and a single slash for a mouth, both hastily drawn with a black marker. She instantly recognized the scent of the marker ink. It smelled exactly like the markers they used in school. And was the balloon a leftover from Molly Rogers' birthday 3 weeks ago? Was it? A large hand clamped down on her shoulder, and Mariana's thoughts scattered into a cloud of incoherent panic. The hand twirled her around, and Mariana found herself looking up at Mrs. Blackmore. She sneered. "I'm sorry to ruin your fun, but the reality is that dragons were just sickly little worms, hardly bigger than a crocodile. Do you think that old, blowhard St. George would have managed to kill a lizard the size of a willow tree? Oh, please. The man was long past his prime and utterly riddled with syphilis. What was Miss Wright teaching you empty-headed little cretins anyway? Certainly not the facts, that's for sure." Mariana couldn't move. Not one single muscle in her entire being. She could only look on helplessly from the windows of her eye sockets, a prisoner in her own body. "Still, you're a good deal brighter than most of the others, aren't you?" she crooned. "Your mind, your spark so bright. Mercy, yes. Such a fine addition to my collection." Mariana was trying to scream, but her throat was locked up tighter than a bank vault, and her tongue was pinned on the roof of her mouth. All she could manage was a low, burbling groan that was lost beneath the noisy background of morning traffic, tittering songbirds, and the stream of children's laughter who were cutting through the park on their way to school. Mrs. Blackmore gave her a curled smile and a knowing nod. "The bad ones always kick up a fuss when it's time to go in the bag. They try and scream and run, and every once in a blue moon, one of you horrible little brats gets away from me." Mrs. Blackmore leaned in close, her eyes glinting with dull flickers of red and green in the gloom, and she snarled. "But rest assured, dearie, it's never for long. I'll get your friends too, both of them, and into the bag they'll go, brat, just like you." Mrs. Blackmore held up her bag, its leering zipper of a mouth gaping wide in anticipation. Mariana heard a distant cacophony of countless souls, all of them lost and wailing in the dark. The substitute grabbed her by the back of the neck and grunted, "Get in there, bright one! Get into your new— Ow! You nasty little beast!" Mrs. Blackmore jerked her hand away and did a mad little dance of pain, shaking her hand in the air and then clutching it close to her chest. She squealed, "Take it off! Take it off right now and get in the bag!" Mariana touched her necklace, a simple chain made of silver, and she pulled it out of her shirt, holding it in front of her like a cross in a vampire movie. Mariana began to advance on Mrs. Blackmore, who fell back with a frightened snarl on her lips. She grunted, "You don't like this much, do you?" And Mrs. Blackmore violently shook her head no. "It burns," she panted. "Hateful silver! I'll tear off your ears for doing that! There was a dull thud, and Mrs. Blackmore fell to her knees, clutching the back of her head with a startled squawk of pain. Ian was standing behind her, raising a second large rock above his head with his lips twisted in a desperate grimace. He brought it down with all the force he could muster, and Mrs. Blackmore fell onto her face in the dirt. Mariana shrilled, "Oh my God, Did you just kill her?" "I wouldn't bet on it," Ian gasped. "Come on, let's go." They fled into the sunlight, the soles of their sneakers slapping the pavement in a frantic rhythm as they ran for their lives. Behind them, Mrs. Blackmore crawled out from beneath the dragon tree and screeched, "Go ahead! Run as fast as you can! I'll find you!" Ian said, "Call Scotty," and he put on a burst of speed. Mariana pulled out her phone and dialed Scotty's cell number, still running as she held the phone to her ear. She listened to it ring on the other end and panted, "Answer your phone, idiot! Answer your stupid phone! Come on! She's coming!" Unlike either of his friends, Scotty had slept like a baby the night before, and he hadn't thought about Mrs. Blackmore even once that entire evening. Mariana had called to tell him they were going to meet up in the morning to talk about the substitute, but he honestly had no idea why. She was a weird, spooky lady or whatever, sure, like, really weird. But what were they supposed to do? Call the weird lady police and have her tossed in a weird lady jail? They didn't have any evidence that she'd done anything wrong, for crying out loud. For someone who was supposed to be smart, Mariana could be awfully dumb. Scotty was honestly more concerned about Ian. The poor guy almost walked into traffic like a zombie, and he didn't even take the bait for Scotty's joke last night. Obviously, the boy wasn't feeling right in the head, because that joke was friggin' mint. Anyone could have seen that, even a humorless ass monkey like Ian. Scotty ate his usual breakfast that morning, a mixing bowl of Count Chocula cereal, and he bounced off the front door with his customary manic zest for life. He was supposed to meet Mariana and Ian at the front entrance before school started, but he was already thinking that maybe he'd just dodge into the side door and catch up with them at recess. Maybe Mrs. Blackmore wouldn't even be here today, who knows? She was a substitute. They came and went like the tides. Scotty rounded the corner and nimbly dodged around a cranky-looking man with a slight limp. He had two small kids trailing behind him, both with sullen expressions that spoke of a recent yelling from dear old Dad. The man looked at Scotty and snarled, "Watch it, not in the mood right now, buddy." Scotty shot back, "That's what your wife says, buddy," and skipped away from the onslaught of righteous indignation that followed. When he was a safe distance away, Scotty looked back and hollered, "Stop trying to touch my bathing suit areas! What the hell, dude?" The man flashed as red as a beet and hurried on his way. Scotty crossed the street, chuckling at his own sharp wit, and then something unusual caught his ear. He stopped to listen, his smile fading a bit, and he heard it again. Bang! Ring! The tinny ring of a tarnished old bell floated through the mid-spring air. A moment later, Mrs. Blackmore came rolling into view in an old-fashioned penny-farthing bicycle. Scotty scrambled behind a mailbox and watched in slack-jawed shock as she zipped past on her comical bicycle and rolled down the street. She was wearing leather driving gloves and a pair of aviator goggles. The hem of her dress snapped and fluttered behind her as she pumped the pedals with her square-toed boots, grinning her ferocious grin as she rang the bell with childish glee. She thundered, "Excuse me, sir," and zoomed between Dad and his children with scant inches to spare on either side. They didn't even seem to notice her. Her towering bicycle growled at them with a whirring of its spokes, an unprecedented beast on wheels. Mrs. Blackmore pedaled around the man and his children in looping circles as they marched out of view, cawing mad laughter and ringing the bell. She cried, "Has anyone seen a red-headed boy walk past here by any chance? He's a very bad boy, you know. He and his friends are all nasty, horrible little tattletales." The man and his children kept walking. None of them showed any reaction at all to this bizarre spectacle, not so much as a puzzled glance over their shoulders. A sudden metallic taste of fear stung the inside of Scotty's tongue. This was more than just weird. It was simply not possible. There was no way this was actually happening. Mrs. Blackmore quickly tired of harassing the man and his children and pedaled away down the street, ringing her bell and heckling passers-by along the way. No one reacted to this insanity in the slightest. She was invisible to them. "Where's her bag?" Scotty muttered, and he realized that Mrs. Blackmore was currently sitting on the damn thing. Her handbag had transformed into an old-timey bicycle. A spidery and gothic-looking contraption that was straight out of the days of cholera and heavily waxed mustaches. As he watched her turn the corner, Scott nimbly wondered if her magic satchel could also take on the shape of a broomstick. He scampered into the street and flapped his arms like a maniac at oncoming traffic. He needed to vacate the area and needed to do it right now before Mrs. Blackmore circled back around the block. Sooner or later, she'd find him, and no one would see it happen. No one would hear his screams. A black SUV hybrid screeched to a halt. An irate-looking woman with mirrored sunglasses rolled down her window to yell, "What the fuck, kid? Get out of the road!" Scott ran up to the passenger side door and frantically tugged on the handle. "Let me in," he pleaded. His mind raced to find a substitute of evil witch lady on a huge bike, something that didn't sound quite as batshit crazy. He took a deep breath and hissed, "Some guy running around naked under his coat." The lock clicked open and Scott scrambled inside. He slammed the door, shouting, "He's coming after us! Go!" Scott pretended to point out the fictional sex deviant as he advanced on them, but the driver of the SUV didn't even turn her head. Instead, she let out an ear-piercing shriek and stomped on the gas. "What happened?" she demanded. "Did he get you?" Scotty gasped. "He didn't get me. I ran away. I need to talk to the police." "I'll take you there," the woman exclaimed. Her voice was strained to a potent mixture of fear and outrage. "I can't believe he came after us like that. Did you see that? He had his thing out." "I know, it's crazy." Scotty was only half listening to the driver's excited babbling. He was too busy keeping an eye peeled for Mrs. Blackmore. "Tried to get us." "That's what they do," the driver explained, and she pounded the horn with the heel of her palm, making Scotty almost jump out of his skin. "He's not gonna get away with it. What's your name, kid?" It's Ian," Scotty said. And despite the situation, he had to suppress a grin. "My friends call me Spanky, though." The woman patted his head absently, her attention temporarily diverted by a Jetta that was ambling along at 10 under the limit. She grunted. "Pleased to meet you, Sparky. My name's Candace." In the same breath, she roared, "Get out of the way, dumbass! Some people have places to go!" Scotty's explosive new acquaintance forced her way into the right lane and aggressively overtook the offending Jetta, riding on the bumper of the car ahead of her until she could cut out in front of her nemesis with hardly more than a few feet to spare. The Jetta blasted its horn in indignation. Candace responded by sticking her arm out of the window and flipping the bird. She roared, "Eat a bag of dog shit, fuckface!" To Scotty, she muttered, "Can't wait to file a report against that sick bastard, Spanky. Not the Jetta, the other guy with his thing hanging out. I'm not leaving until the cops take our information." "Yeah," Scotty nodded. "They'll get him. Cops will..." "Oh, hey! Turn left to the stop sign. It's faster that way." Scotty was staring out his window in open-mouthed horror. They were pulling up to a T intersection, and down the street to their right, Mrs. Blackmore was performing a perfect handstand from the handles of her bicycle as she rolled along the center line. Her skirt was standing up straight in the air, defying gravity in a darkly comical show of modesty. Unreality washed over him, threatening to drown him in a sludgy wave of nervous exhaustion. Candace turned left without question. She was too busy recounting the details of their imaginary brush with a predator, presumably to get things straight in her mind before they spoke with the police. Scotty just kept nodding his head and saying, "Yeah, I know, right?" Or, "I think so." Whichever seemed more appropriate when a pause in her diatribe demanded a response. All he wanted was for the lady to shut up for a second and give him a chance to gather himself before he started talking. If he had started screaming, he didn't think he'd be able to stop. They hit a red light a few minutes down the road, and Scotty's entire being went wire-taut with tension. Candace patted his hand again and assured him, "You're safe, kid. No one's following us. I've been watching." A shabby-looking man in a grimy old sun hat shuffled into the intersection and began to wander down the line of waiting vehicles, carrying a plastic bucket in one hand and clutching a gas station squeegee in the other. Scotty watched his progress with narrowed eyes. One of these people," Candace scowled. "He better not touch my truck. No, thank you." The man lurched up to the SUV and motioned at the windshield with his squeegee. Candace answered with a sharp blast of her horn. He flinched in surprise and slouched away, clearly mouthing, "Fuck you too, lady," as she at her through the window as he shambled out of view. Scotty's phone started vibrating in his pocket. It was Mariana, and she sounded out of breath. "Where the heck are you? Listen, plans have changed. We're not meeting at school anymore. She's after us. We're going straight to the police." "All right, I'm on my way," Scotty snapped back at her. "I had to flag down some lady in her truck to get away. She's taking me to the police station right now." "Who's that?" Candace demanded. "Was that perv bothering someone else too? Oh, speaking of bothering, that bum is coming back. He can just stay the hell away from my truck." Candace was glaring daggers into her side view mirror. Her upper lip curled in disgust. She unrolled her window and bellowed, "The fucking light is about to change, asshole!" There was a blur of motion outside, and Candace's head jerked back from the force of a tremendous blow. Whunk! Her eyes rolled back, and she fell forward against the steering wheel, blood pouring from a deep indent in her forehead. Scotty flinched back against the passenger door and let out a high-pitched scream. Mrs. Blackmore leered at him triumphantly through the driver's side window, the homeless man's sun hat cocked on her head at a rankish angle. Her grimy bucket had been replaced by her handbag. She reached through the window and stabbed the unlock button with a blunt fingertip. Clunk. "Hello, young man," she boomed with a homicidal good cheer. "It's time to get in the bag, my boy. Hop in!" Scotty threw open his door and hit the pavement running. The heavy clunk of Mrs. Blackmore's boots drew ever closer as he sprinted for the nearest escape route, a low wooden fence that bordered someone's backyard. He vaulted over it with the grace of an Olympic gymnast and dashed through an obstacle course of rusting tricycles and faded plastic toys. Behind him, there was an explosive crack as Mrs. Blackmore came bursting through the fence like a bulldozer, sending a shower of splinters and chunks of lumber flying through the air. She bellowed, "There's nowhere to run, brat!" And Scotty wailed with terror. He scampered through a series of newly planted flower beds in the front yard and blindly ran into the street. He charged across the path of a full-sized cargo van and narrowly missed getting plowed over by 3 windmilling steps. Behind him, there was a tremendous bang, and the driver locked up the brakes, sliding into a screeching halt in the middle of the street. The shaken driver leapt out of the van and bellowed, "Hey, kid! Did y'all just throw something in my van, you little piece of shit?" Scotty didn't spare a breath to answer him. He ran another 4 blocks before he staggered to a halt in front of a variety store, his lungs burning like fire in his chest. He couldn't run anymore. He had to hide. It was going to take a lot more than getting hit by a cargo van to stop Mrs. Blackmore. A lot more. The elderly man behind the counter took his terrified expression and grunted. "My God, boy, what happened to you?" Don't tell her I'm here," Scotty panted. "She'll kill us both." He scrambled past the counter and headed for the back of the store. The man behind the counter started after him and hollered, "Where do you think you're going? You, boy, come back here!" Scotty whirled to face him and shouted, "Listen to me. A lady's gonna walk in here in a minute, okay? A tall lady wearing all black. Don't tell her I'm here. If you do, she'll kill us both. I'm not kidding, mister. I'm sorry for yelling, but this is not a joke." The clerk stopped in his tracks, stunned to uncertainty by the sheer panic in his voice. Faintly, he asked, "What is this again?" There was no time to make a story up on the fly. Not this time. The elderly gent in the forest green trousers was simply going to have to swallow the truth. "She might look like someone else," Scotty croaked. His voice was raspy and dry. "She could wear something that belongs to someone else and look exactly like them. She can make herself invisible. She can do lots of things, mister. You won't be able to stop her." Slowly, the old man asked, "And why would this woman be chasing you?" Scotty almost said, "Because I'm a tattletale," and he burped up an unsteady giggle. "She calls herself Mrs. Blackmore. I doubt that's her real name. She's chasing me and my friends because we know the truth about her. She steals people. She puts them in her handbag." "You're pulling my leg, boy," the clerk grunted. "It's nonsense. What happened to you? Tell me the truth." Scotty stomped his foot and shrieked, "This lady's gonna kill you. She'll rip you apart and she'll do something even worse to me. You have to hide me somewhere until she's gone. Please, she's coming." The old man gawked at him through thick, square lenses of his glasses. And after a stunned moment of silence, he said, "Go in the broom closet. Last door on the back. There's nothing to steal in there." Scotty was already closing the door to the broom closet behind him. The clerk rapped lightly on the other side and told him, "I'll wait 15 minutes before I call the police. Not 1 second longer." Scotty croaked, "She'll be here any minute. Don't say a word." Before long, Scotty heard the muted ding of a bell as someone came into the store. The clerk's soft sole shoes whispered across the faded tile as he huffed his way back to the counter. Scotty held his breath and listened. "Yes, how can I help you?" A husky voice drawled, "Can I ask you something, sir?" Scotty bit down on a scream. It was the driver of the cargo van. He recognized his voice, but was it really the driver? He doubted it. He doubted it very much. "Looking for my son. Me and him had it out this morning and took off running. I'm worried about him. Have you seen him?" Scotty cowered in the very farthest corner of the little closet, standing in the mop sink and hugging himself as tightly as he could. Don't tell her, he thought. Come on, man, please don't tell her. Slowly, the clerk said, Your son, what does he look like? Scotty forced himself to peek through the crack between the door and the frame. He saw Mrs. Blackmore standing in front of the counter. She was stuffed into a pair of blue overalls. The arms and legs were both several inches too short for her, exposing pale, veiny wrists and shins. They looked a lot like the overalls the van driver had been wearing. They were covered in large, irregular patches of maroon that appeared to be bloodstains. The trusty handbag dangling from her hand like a kitten being carried by the scruff of its neck. Her bag appeared to be frowning at this undignified treatment. My son is about this tall. He's got bright red hair. Might look kind of banged up. I smacked him for cursing at his mother. That's why he ran off. Mrs. Blackmore shook her head in mock sadness. He was always a good kid, real good kid. I'm worried it might be drugs. Scotty's gaze flicked to the convex mirror mounted in the upper corner of the room, and he did a double take. In the mirror, Mrs. Blackmore appeared to be a burly man in his early 40s, heavily bearded with a touch of gray in his hair. The coveralls he was wearing were free of rips and clotted splotches of dried blood. The handbag was a stainless steel lunch pail. He thought, I could see her because she doesn't know that I'm looking. The old man cleared his throat and said, I apologize, sir, but I cannot help you. Scotty felt his knees go weak in relief. Thank you, oh my God, thank you. I haven't seen your son, the old man continued, but if I do, who should I contact? Mrs. Blackmore held up a finger to silence him, her face suddenly alert. She sniffed the air like a dog that caught an interesting scent, her nostrils flaring as she skinned her lips back from her teeth. No, you've seen him, you filthy liar, she sighed. He's been in here. I can smell him. Scotty's stomach dropped into her shoes. Of course she could smell him. Why not? She was a predator, wasn't she? The old man took a step back from his side of the counter, his polite smile frozen on his face. He sputtered, What is that? I can smell him, Mrs. Blackmore repeated. He stinks like a nasty little troublemaker. She seized the front of the coveralls and tore them away with one quick, hard jerk of her arms. Rip! She threw them aside and crowded close to the counter, a monolithic figure draped in flowing sheaves of black. The clerk stared up at her darkening, gleeful face with eyes like saucers. He gasped, Gott im Himmel. Oh my God. And Mrs. Blackmore pantomimed a bored yawn. No one's seen him since Moses, she sneered. I don't think he comes around much anymore. The old man croaked. Are you a witch? And Mrs. Blackmore's ill-tempered smirk melted into a frown. She plopped her bag on top of the lottery ticket display and planted her hands on her hips. Mercy, that's an offensive slur, Mr. Grouper. I'll have you know that I am not in league with the devil, as far as I can tell. The devil doesn't even exist. I'm just in tune with the natural world around us. That's all. It just so happens that your definition of the natural world is a lot different than mine. The clerk looked completely shocked. He whispered, How do you know my real name? Mute as a rock, blind as a stone. The root where you stand, she chanted, and the clerk ceased in function. It was as if he'd been turned off with a switch. He was alive and animated one second, and a motionless mannequin the next. Mrs. Blackmore turned her back to him and sniffed the air again. She smiled. I know you're in here, boy, she called out. Once again, you put me in a difficult position. I can't allow this man to live, can I? His death will be on your soul, my child, not mine. And poor Candace. She may have been a quarrelsome scold, but she didn't deserve to go out like that. Mrs. Blackmore clicked her tongue in scorn. If it weren't for you, she would still be alive. Do you see now? Do you see why you must follow the rules? Loose lips sink ships. I'm fucked, Scotty thought, and tears started to leak down his cheeks. I'm so completely fucked right now. "You can't hide from me, child," she called out. "I was once forced to serve as a bloodhound for an Irish war king. It's been a long time, but I assure you I can still track a scent." Mrs. Blackmore began to literally follow her nose, snuffling at the air as she shuffled to the back of the store. She dropped to her hands and knees in front of the cold case, sniffing at the floor as she grinned through her hair. "The king would offer condemned criminals a choice. They could place their heads on the chopping block, or they could try and evade the hunt and possibly win their freedom. He would release them at the edge of the forest, and then I'd be set on their trail. I was better than any hound the king had ever owned, or so he was prone to saying when he was in his cups. For 18 miserable years, I led the hunt with my nose in the dirt, and my robes dangling through the dead leaves. I ate scraps from the bastard's supper table and slept in a kennel. I suffered these indignities and bided my time because I knew that no king is infallible forever. Their time will always come in the end." Mrs. Blackmore rose to her feet and sauntered toward the broom closet, her booted heel clunking on the floor in a deliberate rhythm. Mr. Gruber stood frozen in the background, gazing at nothing, with his features hanging in a slack non-expression. Scotty crammed himself back into the corner of the broom closet, standing in the mop sink with the cold water tap digging into his back. He could hear his teeth chattering behind his lips. "When the king was disposed by his rival, I decided to stage a hunt of my own. He thought he'd thrown me off his scent by crossing the river, but the poor old bugger slipped on the embankment and broke his leg. He soiled himself and screamed for his mother when he saw me coming for him, and I don't blame him one bit. There was 18 years of humiliation to answer for, a heavy debt he paid in full." The light beneath the door disappeared, blocking out a towering shape on the other side. Mrs. Blackmore pattered her fingertips against the door in a rapid rhythm, mimicking a drum roll. It ended with a wood-cracking blow from her fist. Patter, 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 wham! Ian flinched and stifled a whimper. "The king suffered 1,000 deaths on that day. Oh, mercy, yes, the poor dear suffered quite terribly." The closet door slammed open, and Scotty squealed in terror. At that precise moment, there was the muted jingle of a bell as someone walked through the front door. Not just someone. It was a uniformed police officer. The cop tossed out an absent-minded, "Morning, Heinrich," and strolled past the counter without a second glance at Mr. Gruber, who was still frozen in place like a grotesque mannequin. He swaggered up to the coffee counter and started fixing himself a large coffee. Mrs. Blackmore gaped at him in disbelief. "Crazy out here today, old fellow," he said, stirring milk into his brew. "The wackadoodles are out in full force. All kinds of shit's going on out there." "Officer!" Scotty screeched. "Watch out, she's gonna kill you!" The cop whirled in the direction of the voice and drew his gun at the same time, dropping his coffee and hauling his sidearm from its holster in one smooth motion. He found himself pointing a gun at a square-jawed woman in indeterminate age, tall and broad in her flowing black garments. He'd been on the job for close to 15 years, and in that time, he'd developed a sixth sense for bad guys and wackadoodles. He immediately knew that this woman was in one or both categories. "Why didn't I lock that damn door?" Mrs. Blackmore snapped, and she started advancing on him. The cop pointed his firearm at her and said, "Lady, I don't know what your story is, but I think you better stay right where you are." He cast a quick glance over at Mr. Gruber and snapped, "Heinrich, what the hell's going on here?" The cop trailed off when he noticed Mr. Gruber's bizarre state of non-animation. Mrs. Blackmore was still clomping along, steadily closing the distance between them with a big, scissoring stride. The officer curled his finger around the trigger and bellowed, "Stop, or I will shoot! Get down on the ground!" "Do as you please, sir," she grinned, and the cop squeezed off 4 rapid shots in response. At the same instant, Mrs. Blackmore dissolved into a cloud of black mist. The shots hit the cold case with an explosion of glass and a rainbow of fizzing liquids. As fragments of glass and carbonated sugar water rained onto the floor, the mist shot forward in a rolling wave, and in the blink of an eye, it resolved as Mrs. Blackmore. She yelled, "Gotcha, Flatfoot!" and seized the hulking cop's forearm. She folded it backwards at the elbow. Snap! And the cop let loose a quavering, high-pitched scream. The gun fell from his nerveless hand, and he whirled from the door. his broken arm flopping uselessly at his side. The substitute cackled feral laughter and hammered him with a brutal punch to the kidneys. Whump! The cop's scream was abruptly cut off by a straggling grunt. He dropped into the fetal position and writhed on the floor. Mrs. Blackmore tutted at him in a disappointed tone and pinned him with a boot heel on his throat. He gagged and yanked at her foot with his good hand, his legs kicking spastically as she struggled to escape. She threw her hands up in exasperation and called out, "Look! Do you see, Scott? Do you see what you've made me do, you nasty little brat? This is very inconsiderate. Killing everyone in the whole damn town is not how you live to see your 6,000th birthday." Strangling beneath the unyielding pressure in his throat, the cop gagged, Get off my neck!" Mrs. Blackmore ignored him. She summoned Scotty to come out of his hiding place with a lazy twitch of her finger. A schoolmarm preparing to pete out corporal punishment against a defiant pupil. Her eyes flashed a blazing scarlet and she snarled, "You should have been crushed beneath the wheels of that van, my boy. That would have been merciful compared to what I have in store for you." She twisted her foot with a grinding motion, and the cop abruptly went limp. Scotty burst into tears, and Mrs. Blackmore started to laugh. "Oh, they do cry, don't they? They do cry when the end is near." She stepped off the policeman's neck, still grinning, and she slowly made her way back to the broom closet. Scotty stuffed himself into the corner again and covered his face with his hands. The end was near, and there was nothing he could do to save himself. It was time to get in the bag. Ian ran out of gas in front of the Eastgate shopping plaza and stumbled to a halt. He wheezed. Far enough. And hunched over to catch his breath. He gripped his side and gasped, "Can't run anymore. Gonna pass out." Mariana waited beside him impatiently, tapping her shoe in a nervous rhythm as Ian struggled to not puke on the sidewalk. He was paler than milk, and his eyes were glassy with shock. "I hit her with a rock. She's gonna be really mad now." "She was already pretty mad," Mariana said faintly. "I don't think it matters." Ian forced himself to stand up straight. The nausea had passed, but the stitch in his side still hurt like fire. He spat out a sour wad of phlegm and asked, "Do you think she went after Scotty?" Mariana shook her head slowly. She said, "I don't know. I got a text from him as I was leaving the house. He told me to meet you guys at the Dragon Tree. I haven't heard from him since." "That probably wasn't him," Ian croaked in a wooden tone. "It was her." Mariana pressed her lips together in an unhappy line and said, "Yeah, I wouldn't doubt it. Can you at least walk now? The police station isn't that far from here." Ian's answer was interrupted by the sound of gunshots from somewhere in the plaza, followed by a high-pitched scream. Ian and Mariana both ducked down, and Mariana whimpered, "Where did that come from?" "I think it came from the store with the old guy who always wears the same green pants. It must be a robbery or something." Mariana shook her head. "When do we ever have an armed robbery in this town? Now I have a feeling it's got something to do with our favorite substitute teacher. Let's sneak up and have a look." They scrambled up to the corner of the building and pressed themselves flat against the wall on either side of the entrance. Ian carefully leaned over to have a peek through the glass door. He whispered, "It's her. She's got her foot on someone's neck. I think it's a cop." There was a muffled scream from inside the store. Ian made a face and pressed himself back against the wall. "I think she just killed the cop." The second scream was definitely Scotty. "We gotta go on the count of 3. Are you ready?" "No," Mariana said in a small, miserable voice. And she slipped off her necklace with trembling fingers. "Start counting." Mrs. Blackmore filled the doorway of the broom closet, blotting out the light and plunging Scotty into darkness. He squinted his eyes shut against his own terror and yelled, "Fuck off and leave me alone!" Mrs. Blackmore opened her mouth to issue a witty retort, and there was a soft ding as someone entered through the front entrance. She gritted her teeth in frustration and hissed, "Oh, for the love of Pete! Keep forgetting to lock the damn door!" She turned to confront the new interloper and looked genuinely surprised to see Ian and Mariana walk up to the snack food aisle. She narrowed her eyes and said, "What's this?" Why aren't you hiding beneath your beds, you fools? Have you gone daft? Mariana let the silver chain slither out of her hand, and she started to whirl it around in a tight circle. She advanced on Mrs. Blackmore with her teeth bared in an unconscious snarl. Ian trailed close behind her with a large can of fruit cocktail mix clutched in either hand. Mariana yelled, "Get away from us!" And Mrs. Blackmore flinched from the commanding tone in her voice. She didn't understand what was happening. Even though she had terrorized these children to their very core, the fire of the fight still burned in their eyes. It had been so long since anyone dared to stand against her. Mrs. Blackmore had forgotten something very important. The bonds of true friendship are more powerful than fear. She backed away from Mariana's twirling chain, her handbag braced in front of her like a shield. She sneered, "Do you think you can defeat me with a necklace, my girl? Mercy, no. You put that down right now, right this instant, and get in the damn bag." While her full attention was focused on Mariana, Ian seized the opportunity to launch one of his fruit cocktails. It whizzed through the air and bounced off her forehead with a dull thud. Cutting off her words and making her stumble into mid-step, Mariana darted in without hesitation and whipped her across the face with the chain. There was a sizzling pop when the silver made contact with her skin, and the substitute howled in agony. She rammed through a display of snack foods to escape the unexpected assault, sending bags of peanuts and potato chips flying in all directions. She stamped her foot in a childish rage and bellowed, "How dare you! How dare you do that to me!" She drew out the last syllable in a scream of childish outrage, and then abruptly collapsed into a shapeless, writhing cloud of mist. It reared up and surged towards the door, a boiling river of nightmares and midnight. There was a tremendous crash as the door exploded in a spray of twisted metal and broken glass. And then she was gone. The two of them stood amongst the wreckage and stared at the ragged hole in the wall that used to be a doorway. Ian took in a deep, shuddering breath and moaned, "I don't want to do this anymore." Mariana pushed past him and cautiously ventured outside. The sidewalk was covered in a litter of glass. A scattering of people were drifting closer to see what was going on, some of them already filming with their cell phones. Mariana grunted, "Oh crap," and darted back into the store. Ian was herding an extremely shaken-looking Scotty to the front of the store. His hair was a sweaty, tangled mop, and his blue jeans had been torn wide open at the knee, revealing a large scrape that was still oozing blood. Scotty wheezed. "She almost got me. I think I pissed myself a little bit." Ian gave him a clumsy side hug and crowed, "You almost got her. You should have seen the look on her face. She couldn't believe we were standing up to her. She didn't know what to do." Mariana grimaced and shook her head. "We surprised her. She won't be surprised next time." Scotty hauled his phone out of his pocket and said, "Next time? It ain't gonna be a next time. What are you even talking about? I'm not gonna do shit except call 911. You know, like a normal person. Are you freaking crazy?" Mariana vaguely motioned at the body on the floor. She said, "They can't stop her. The goofy witch costume and all that stuff? That's not the real Mrs. Blackmore. It's just an act. She looks like a scary cartoon character, but the real Mrs. Blackmore is a lot worse. She isn't human anymore." Scotty waved his phone at her and snorted, "I don't know, Mariana, that kinda sounds like a good reason to call the cops." Quietly, Ian said, "Her bag's alive. They're almost like partners or something. She feeds it, and the bag powers her magic." "It's her familiar," Mariana replied. Her brow was furrowed in thought. "They need each other to exist." Scotty pointedly cleared his throat and motioned at the entrance. An older man in jean shorts and a Bermuda shirt was standing in the shattered doorway. He was recording the aftermath of their encounter with his mouth hanging open in disbelief. Scotty whispered, "Let me handle this." He jumped in front of his friends and shrieked, "You're violating our rights!" in a voice that could be heard from miles. The man flinched back and tried to speak out in his defense, but Scotty just dialed the volume a little higher and yelled over him. When it became clear the wild-eyed kid with the red hair wasn't about to quit anytime soon, the man wisely decided to tuck his phone away and beat a hasty retreat. A mingling wail of multiple sirens began to rise in the distance. Mariana took each of her friends by the hand, gave them a firm squeeze, and said, "We better leave before they get here. Let's go." Ian pulled his hand back and exclaimed, "Wait a second! Scotty's right. We should tell the cops and let them figure it out. We're just kids, you know? We can't do this alone." "No," Mariana said faintly. "They won't know how to fight her, and they'll let her get away." Scotty threw up his hands and groaned. We don't know how to fight her either. What are we gonna do? Throw some more cans at her? I don't want to die, Mariana. What's so hard to understand about that? Ian gave Mariana a grim look and said, he's got a point. What are we supposed to do? She said something about getting wrapped in silver chains. If that's the only way to beat her, we're screwed. If she talked about it, it's probably happened to her before, Mariana countered. She's still here, so it obviously didn't kill her. No, we have to make it so she can't ever come back again. Yeah? But how, Mariana? Scott demanded. I think Ian's right. If we try to take her on, we're screwed. Both of you just listen for a second, Mariana pleaded. Okay? Just listen. Look, do you remember how the dragon tree really did look like a dragon when we were little? We used to pretend it was alive. Even now you can still see it if you stretch your imagination a bit, right? Imagination is kind of like magic. It's way stronger when you're a kid. In another 10 years, we'll be all thinking about finding a career and paying our bills. We won't be able to see the dragon anymore. When you're an adult, you start worrying all the time. And it kills the magic. I mean, you're not wrong, Scotty said impatiently. But what's your point? Mariana gave an unhappy smile and answered, Mrs. Blackmore goes after kids because she needs that magic inside us. I think we can use it against her. Scotty gaped at her in disbelief and sputtered, This isn't a freaking movie, Mariana. Like, we're not just going to defeat the bad guys because we believe in ourselves. It's just stupid. We can't do this. We're just kids, Mariana finished. She took a deep breath and said, I get that you're scared. Me too. I don't want to do this, like, at all. It's not fair. But responsibility isn't always a choice. And things aren't always fair. Scotty wiped a shimmer of a tear from his eyes with the collar of his t-shirt. He cleared his throat and croaked, Yeah, well, it's dumb and it sucks. As gently as possible, Mariana told him, We're all growing up, Scotty. We won't be kids for much longer. It has to be us. And it has to be now. If we don't stop her, she'll just keep doing what she's doing forever. And it'll be our fault for not standing up to her when we had the chance. Scotty pressed his lips together in a tight line. He sniffled. Still dumb and it still sucks. But okay, fine. Where are we going? Ian said. I bet she probably went back to the school. It would be too suspicious if she just left without a word. Yeah, and maybe grabbed a few more kids while she's at it, Mariana muttered. Not if we can help it. Here, give me a second. Mariana grabbed a notebook and a pen from a display of impulse items beside the counter, and she quickly wrote something down. She examined her work, then added a few more hasty strokes with a pen before carefully tearing out the page. She folded it into her pocket and said, Okay, let's go. Hey, what about him? Scotty asked and pointed at the cashier. The old man was still frozen in place, one hand clutching the counter, the other raised to ward off Mrs. Blackmore's touch. Mariana hesitated and then said, I think he'll be okay. We'll see. A fire truck came screaming past as they hurried down the street, followed by an ambulance and 2 police cruisers. Ian turned his head and watched them go by. His feet felt like they were made of lead, but he didn't feel nauseous anymore. And that was a start. He looked at Mariana and asked, What if we don't win? What happens then? Mariana didn't respond, but she didn't have to. They all knew the answer to the question. If they failed to defeat Mrs. Blackmore, there would be no fairy tale ending. "10 minutes later, they were standing in front of the school's main entrance. Scotty turned to the other two and said, Does this look, different to you guys? The entrance did indeed look very different. The big double doors appeared to be much taller and narrower than they were just yesterday. They were set far back in a deep, dark alcove that reminded Ian a little too much of a cave. He peered into the menacing gloom and felt his heartbeat quicken. He sighed. Yeah, she's definitely here. Okay, let's get this over with. They stepped out of the warm sunshine and into a damp, clammy twilight of rancid smells and deep shadows. Mariana opened the flashlight app on her phone, revealing crumbling brickwork that was shrouded in multiple layers of spiderwebs. The spiders were pale, bloated, poisonous-looking things, some of them almost as big as her hand. Their eyes glinted a deep crimson in the white glare of the flashlight. Scotty grimaced and rubbed his hand on his jeans, a compulsive gesture of disgust. Holy crap, look at those things! Like golf balls with legs! Mariana curled her lip and delicately brushed a thick mantle of spiderwebs away from the door handle. She wiped her hand on the leg of her pants and said, "Ignore it. She's trying to get under our skin. Listen, we go straight to Mr. Delvin's office, okay? Just ignore everything around you and keep moving." The door swung open with an ominous squeal of corroded hinges. The floor, walls, and even the ceiling of the vestibule appeared to be crusted with a copious amount of dried blood. It smelled like rancid meat and copper. Ian could taste it on his tongue. "Keep going," Mariana said briskly, and she pushed her companions through the interior doors that opened into the main corridor. It was pitch black in the corridor, and the feral stench of the air made the stink of the gore-spattered vestibule seem like freshly laundered bedsheets in comparison. The puny glow emanating from Mariana's phone could barely penetrate the all-encompassing darkness, leaving them blind beyond the radius of 6 or 7 feet. Mariana whispered, "Keep going." But there wasn't much conviction behind her words. The other two turned on their flashlight apps, and they continued, slowly revealing a madhouse nightmare of a hallway, with no doors, light, or discernible features of any kind. Just endless white walls boxing in an endless white floor, capped by a seemingly infinite stretch of white ceiling tiles above their heads. Scotty turned to shine his light behind them, and he asked, "So, what if this just keeps going forever?" Ian glared at him. "Don't say things like that," he grunted. "That isn't helping." "It's getting smaller," Scotty insisted. "Are you telling me you can't see that?" Ian muttered. "It's not getting smaller. Stop freaking yourself out." Scotty retorted. "Look at this, dumbass. I can almost touch the ceiling now, and that smell. It smells like ass in here, my guy. It smells like the monkey house at the zoo." "He's right," Mariana interjected. "The hallway is getting smaller. Ignore it. She's messing with us." Scotty gasped. "I don't like this kind of shit. I don't like feeling closed in. You guys know I got really bad claustrophobia." "I think you mean claustrophobia," Ian corrected. Then Scotty rounded on him with a wild look in his eyes. He snarled, "Thanks, Dr. Douchebag. You know what I meant. It's like smaller in here, and it's dark, and it reeks like my grandma's bathroom when she takes her Metamucil. Can't you smell that? Fuck this bullshit. F-U-C-K, fuck this stupid shit." Mariana whirled around and yelled, "Keep it together!" Scotty flinched. He was struggling not to cry. She lowered her voice and said, "The only reason she's doing this to us is to make us turn back. If she's trying to make us turn back, it's because she's scared. And if she's scared, do you know what that means? It means we have a chance." "A chance," Scotty repeated. He didn't sound particularly impressed, but he was no longer teetering on the edge of panic. "Yeah, sure, okay. Yeah, I think I'm okay, I'm just..." He trailed off, then whispered, "Be quiet for a second. Do you hear that?" Ian held his breath and listened. Somewhere up ahead of them, a child was softly weeping in the darkness. They all gave each other a look of dread. And then Mariana was lunging to catch Scotty by the back of his shirt as he turned to run. She grabbed him up in a bear hug and hissed, "It's just an illusion. It's a magic trick. Whatever it is, it's not real." "Says you," Scotty whooped breathlessly. "I don't care. I don't want to see it." The sniffling and moaning was drawing closer. Ian called out, "Who's there? Who is that?" A small, frail shadow stepped into the puny glow, and they all screamed in unison. It was Molly Rogers. Her flesh appeared to be partially mummified beneath the dirty rags of her clothes, and her teeth were poking out from behind the dried-out strings of her lips in a ghastly grin. In a low, grating voice, she said, "I'm all alone in the dark, and it hurts." The faceless crowd was forming behind her, filling the narrow space with their dragging footsteps and groans of torment. There were hundreds of lost souls standing in the gloom, and maybe even thousands. They were dead, but they were also somehow hideously alive and aware. The smell was almost unbearable. "You can still save yourselves," Molly pleaded, and she reached for Mariana with a bony, withered hand. Mariana drew away with a sharp exhalation of disgust. Ian stepped in front of her and stammered, "We might be scared, but so are you, Mrs. Blackmore. We're still coming for you." Molly's skeletal face contorted with rage. She shook her bony little fists and cried out, "Come for me then, brat! You'll die like all the rest. You'll suffer in the dark!" In the space of a heartbeat, the trio abruptly found themselves standing in front of the door to the main office. The lights were on. Students were milling through the hall on their way back from recess, and everything appeared to be business as usual. Ian peered into the office through the glass. Everything looked normal enough at a casual glance, but he knew Mrs. Blackmore was waiting for them. She was afraid of them, but she was angry too, and she didn't like loose ends. Scotty looked immensely relieved. He waved a hand to their surroundings and asked, "Is she still here? I mean, everything looks normal to me. Maybe she left." "No," Ian murmured. "She's still here. Look at the door to the principal's office." From their vantage point, it was possible to see down the short hall that led to Mr. Delvin's office. The generic composite wood door had been transformed into a forbidding medieval doorway, replete with a rounded arch and hardware that was hand-forged from iron. "Right," Scott said dejectedly. "Okay then, tally-ho." They pushed through the door and breezed past the reception counter, all of them striving to avoid making eye contact with the office staff. No one appeared to notice them. They slipped down the short hallway to Mr. Delvin's office and stood before the sinister door with eyes like saucers. Scotty whispered, "Okay, so what's the plan?" Mariana grasped the iron ring pull and whispered back, I don't really have a plan. Are you guys ready?" The boys looked at each other and reluctantly nodded. Mariana took a deep breath and fought the urge to bolt out of the office. None of them were ready, including her, but it was far too late to worry about that now. "Here we go," she said, and she pulled open the door. The wild-eyed trio burst inside like a SWAT team, startling Mr. Delvin and making him drop his pen with a sharp gasp of surprise. The mild-mannered principal stared at their wide eyes and trembling lips, and he asked, "What are you doing in my office? Something wrong?" Mariana held up her necklace in a threatening manner and hissed, "I know it's you hiding behind that stupid bow tie. You've got nowhere else to run." The principal's mouth dropped open in shock. He sputtered, "What on earth are you talking about? What's going on here?" Completely wired on fear and adrenaline, Scotty shouted, "We know it's you!" and pounded his skinny fists on Mr. Delvin's desk for dramatic effect. A framed picture of the principal's children fell to the floor with a sound of breaking glass. "Where's your bag, bitch, huh? Why don't you just haul out that disgusting bag of yours and shove it up your ass, because you are history!" Mr. Delvin gaped at the three wild-eyed intruders and shuddered. "What in the world are you... Where's my bag? What does that even mean? And you, why are you waving a necklace at me? Explain yourselves immediately." Hesitantly, Mariana asked, "Mr. Delvin, is it actually you?" Who did you think I was?" the principal demanded. His expression of complete shock was slowly being replaced by red-faced anger. "Of course it's me! You think someone else actually wants to impersonate the principal of a public school? I can assure you that no one in the entire history of the world has ever wanted to do that." Ian could feel himself wilting on the spot. He tried to speak, but nothing came out except for a vaguely apologetic squeak. "You have something to add, Ian? I'm all ears over here, people. Explain yourselves." Scotty clasped his hand together in a pleading gesture and gave Mr. Delvin the puppy dog eyes. "We're really sorry," For real, but there's something you need to know before you get mad, okay? Young man, you just called me a bitch, Mr. Delvin thundered. You broke a framed picture of my children, for God's sake. Mariana clenched her necklace tightly in her fist, her brow wrinkled with a suspicious frown. She tapped the desk with her knuckles to get the principal's attention and asked, Did Mrs. Blackmore come to see you today? Was she just here? Mr. Delvin glowered at her and snapped, It isn't your place to ask that sort of question, but yes, she left about 10 minutes ago. She had an unexpected emergency and had to leave immediately. Now I have a question of my own, people. Why were you all marked absent today? Before anyone could answer, there was a muffled thump as something fell off the unburdened shelf beside the desk. Mr. Delvin scooted his rolling chair over to the corner of his desk and said, Oh, that's unfortunate. Must have forgotten her purse. She'll have to come back for it. He tried to sound casual, but the principal's mood has visibly brightened at the prospect of seeing Mrs. Blackmore one more time. The kids each gave each other a knowing look. Mariana said, Okay, this might be a strange question, but what does that bag look like? Mr. Delvin looked uncertain. He said, Well, it looks like a woman's handbag. Not sure what you're driving at, Mariana. She gave him a grim look and asked, How about Mrs. Blackmore? What does Mrs. Blackmore look like? What does she look like? She's... A muddy look of confusion swept over the principal's face, and for a fleeting moment, he looked lost and afraid. Then he smiled to himself and said, Oh, she's in her early 30s, about 5.5 feet tall. Think she's of Mediterranean descent. Gorgeous smile. Mr. Delvin was no longer speaking to anyone in particular. He had lapsed into a sort of a waking dream state. His eyes rolled slowly back in his head, and he live-streamed the inner monologue of his own subconscious desires. She looks a lot like someone I used to know, Mr. Delvin mused to himself. A neighbor from down the street. She's a fine-looking lady, and I mean, everything was right where you wanted it to be. The principal rested his hand on the bag as he spoke, mauling it with an increasing intensity as he poured out a long-repressed fantasy about a woman who'd probably never even known his name. The bag emitted a soft, warning growl. But Mr. Devlin didn't seem to notice. He was lost in his own darkness. He wrung his hands together and panted. She was a curvy gal, like a pin-up girl. I just wanted to lay my hands on her, you know? I needed it. And so that's exactly what I did. I followed her home one night. When she got to her door, I put my hands on her neck, and I squeezed. As he said the word squeezed, Mr. Devlin clenched a sweaty handful of the ancient leather and violently twisted it. The handbag let out a sharp yipe in response, and the principal's hand abruptly disappeared as the zipper clamped around his wrist with a ferocious crunch. Mr. Devlin sprang up from his chair and fell on his ass on the floor, holding his spurting appendage and screaming at the top of his lungs. The kids lunged for the door, but of course, it wasn't really a door at all. It was Mrs. Blackmore, unmasked, ancient, and terrible to behold. Her face was a bloated, wrinkled mess of warts and random tufts of hair, and 2 tusk-like canines protruded from her lower jaw like a boar. Her eyes were the worst, however. They were just 2 empty sockets, a couple of gaping caverns that crawled with tiny spiders and centipedes. Mrs. Blackmore yelled, "Ah!" like a karate master and slapped the necklace out of Mariana's hand. Quick as a jungle cat, she bent down and swept up the shrieking children in the cage of her massive arms, clutching them together like a jumble of dolls as she executed a shuffling dance of glee. "Oh, I've got you!" she cried out in triumph, and she swung them around with a whirling spin on her heels. "Oh, mercy, yes, I've got you good this time. Now watch what happens when bad children break the rules. Watch!" Her handbag leapt off the principal's desk with its brass jaws gaping wide. It landed over Mr. Devlin's balding head with a wet plunk, briefly, muffling his hysterics before the zipper snapped shut again, crunching through his neck in a great gush of blood. The bag fell onto his lap, letting out a deep belch as blood gouted from the stump of his neck and stained his white dress shirt in a rain of crimson. "The adults disappear bite by bite," she crooned, "but the children must go in whole. It takes a very long time to get used up in the belly of the beast. There's much suffering." The bag shuffled across the carpet like an inchworm and hunkered at her feet with its jaws hanging open. Ian heard a multitude of screams echoing from its depths, wafting out in an odorous breeze of sulfur and decaying flesh. Mrs. Blackmore squeezed her armload of captives together until they were gasping for air, and she purred. "Who's going in first, Do I have any volunteers?" Mariana struggled to turn her head and speak. Mrs. Blackmore tossed the other two aside and held Mariana in the air like a toddler. She whispered, "You first? Very well, bright one. Your light will be the fuel for many tricks and glamours. Mercy, yes." "You've already lost," Mariana croaked. "You can't feel it? You're done." Mrs. Blackmore narrowed her eyes and threw the girl onto the floor, making her bag shuffle out of the way with a cranky growl. She leaned over Mariana and barked. "What's this nonsense? What do you mean?" "I cast a spell on you," Mariana quavered. "It's the most powerful spell I can imagine. You're finished." Mrs. Blackmore stared at her in disbelief. She sneered. "Don't make me laugh. You don't have any magic. You're just a child." Mariana pulled a crumpled piece of paper out of her pocket and held it out for Mrs. Blackmore to see. She said, "No, it's you. You don't have any magic. You're just a thief. You stole it from kids like us. We have the power, not you. See for yourself." Mrs. Blackmore snatched the paper from Mariana's hand and snapped, Let me see that. What's this foolish game you're... What is this?" She trailed off, her mouth dropping open in shock. The paper fell from her hand and fluttered to the floor. Mariana had written, "Mrs. Blackmore doesn't exist. TIDTIND. "No," she muttered. No, it can't be." "True if not destroyed," Mariana said in a husky whisper. "Nothing can beat that. You're finished." Mrs. Blackmore bared her blunt, decaying fangs and shouted, No, you can't do this to me! No!" Mariana smiled up at her, and at that moment, she didn't look like a child at all. She looked like a battle-hardened warrior queen, weary down to her very soul, but victorious at last. Mariana grinned her triumphant grin and snarled, "Oh, mercy, yes." Mrs. Blackmore's face drew down a rictus of agony. She screamed at agony up at the ceiling, her entire body shaking like a skyscraper caught in the throes of an earthquake. She bellowed, "How dare you!" and exploded into a million fragments of nothing. Blam! The interior of the office was belted by a blast of cold, fetid air. And then, she was gone. Her handbag reared up and let loose a mournful howl. It waggled over to the spot where its mistress had disappeared and flopped down, whimpering piteously as it rolled around on the floor. Mariana spied Mr. Devlin's pen lying beside a leg of his desk. She scribbled another line on the piece of paper and snorted, "She's gone, and so are you. Look at this." Beneath Mrs. Blackmore doesn't exist, she added, and her stupid handbag doesn't exist either. The handbag flinched back and squealed in pain. It started violently trembling, still squealing like a tea kettle, then exploded in a thunderclap of displaced air. For a brief instant, Ian thought he heard the voice of the lost rise through in a rapturous song of redemption and release. And then, all was silent. Ian, Scotty, and Mariana all sat there on the floor for a while, looking at each other in deafening quiet. Finally, Scotty let out a weak laugh and said, You're both crying. Mariana wheezed. So are you, dipshit. She clambered to her feet and waved her hand at the door. How is no one pounding on the door right now? Didn't they hear any of that? What, are they deaf? Magic, Ian groaned, and he pulled himself off the floor. No one knows we're here, and they shouldn't know. Look at Mr. Devlin. How are we supposed to explain that? Scotty turned away and shook his head. I'd rather not look, thanks. Think we could just sneak out of here without getting caught? I sort of doubt it. Mariana gingerly stepped through the mess of blood and papers on the floor. She looked out the window and said, Remember when we would pretend the dragon tree could fly us around the world like an airplane? We'd stand under the branches and it would fly us anywhere we wanted to go, remember? Sure, Ian sighed. What's that got to do with... Wait, you're kidding me. Ian and Scotty both rushed over to the window. They looked outside with a mixture of amazement and wonder on their faces, and Scotty mumbled, No way. No way. No freaking way. The dragon tree was waiting for them out in the schoolyard. It was sitting on its haunches with a patient expression on its giant lizard face, looking at them through the window with its mild yellow eyes. Come on, Mariana said softly. One last ride. Anywhere you guys want to go. Ian pushed the screen out of the way and said, Home. I want to go home. Me too, Scotty piped up beside him. I just want to go home. Mariana nodded in agreement. Me three, she said. I want my mom in my bed. Let's all go home. They crawled through the window and approached the dragon tree in a state of awe. It gave them an inquisitive look, and Mariana said, We're all pretty tired. We just want to go home. The dragon tree considered this and gave her an understanding nod. The trio of friends gathered beneath its mighty wings for the very last time, and the dragon tree launched straight up into the sky. Ian started to laugh as the ground receded below, and then they were all laughing. They hooted and hollered and laughed like loons as the dragon tree flew them away. But they weren't rejoicing because they were embarking on an adventure. They were rejoicing because the adventure was over, and they could finally go home again. Hey guys, it's still hot out. Like, unreasonably hot out. And you know what's great when it's unreasonably hot out? Iced tea. So if you guys like iced tea, check out Ivory Monocle Tea. That's my wife's loose leaf tea thing she does on Etsy. Etsy.com/shop/Ivory Monocle Tea. You can get a whole bunch of different kinds of teas on there. They can be made hot if you're insane, or they could be made cold if you live anywhere near the equator. So check out Etsy.com/shop/Ivory Monocle Tea, and you can get a whole bunch of different kinds of teas, from the fruity kind to the caffeinated kind to the kind that's named after Creepypasta things, even one that's named after me, My Dark and Stormy Night. And if you ask, when you order that tea, you can get a little MCP dabbing sticker along with it. Oh, also, I don't think I've ever mentioned this, but I sign all the cards if they're like horror-related teas. So if you ever wanted that, check that out. That's the only place you can get it now. So yeah, check it out. Etsy.com/shop/Ivory Monocle Tea. And as always, I want to give a very big thank you to everybody who supports me on Patreon. Thank you so much. A very big thank you to Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Stephanie Butler, Reaper61167, Bobby Karman, Tristan Pelton, Chance Burnett, Diana Kraus, Vicky McQuicky, SamaHigh, CrusaderChocobo, SpookyShel, Atomaurus, Grand Moth the Milky, Big Smoke 369, Captain Scurvy, SaltyIrishPoet, Estebean, Brayden Morris, Nate Kuhl, HorrorFan1212, Hour Minute Second Time, Kyle Reznak, David Martin, Scare-ington the Unkempt, Robert Malcolm, Angelus, Spanky, Snoochie Boochie, Seclude, Lupita Galvin, That Creepy Chick, Tyler Fletcher, Merxenum, Red Shadowcat, Xavier the Cheyenne, Demix, Sean Cadieu-baker, 6 Gay Rats in a Trenchcoat, Turtleman, Rob Like Sharp Things, Cryolinian, Xavier Graphius, Lord Life's Best, Goring Tremagacy, Maria Walker, Emily Mitchell, Crazy Kid, Mr. Marcus Blitz, Eka Limchok, Dirt Diver 030, Matt Bach, Voice of Sand, Coffee Zombie, Hidden Tiger, Shelly J, Jeremy H, Psychomel, Nana, Deleted Account, Melted Lake, Tali Sue, William King, Darth Miver, Michael Ortiz, Titanic Aries, Bardo Hawk 764, Lambda M98, Harley, Sashi Suzaku, Cronut 509, Kaylee Ambrose, Suji Campbell, Stricken, Freddy Krueger, Happy Birthday Jason Wilson, Lisa Cottrell, Caspian, Hades Nephew, Tater Chip, Acid System, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Benjamin Welvret, Cryptic Nightmares, Kiwi the Sloth, Fester's Lampshade, Sky Harbor, Nico Kyle, Rafael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, and Corey Kenshin. As always, thank you guys so much, because you guys help me do everything that I do here. You guys help pay authors for stories and commission stories and do everything that I can do to make this channel and make this podcast the best it could possibly be. So thank you all for supporting me here. And as always, everyone, sweet dreams.